So my experience in forestry is a bit unique. I come from industry. Most of my experience has been with some of the largest landowners in the country. These are guys who, on top of owning hundreds of thousands or even millions of acres, have their own sawmills, chip plants, build their own extensive private road systems, and in some cases even have their own air force of sorts. So compared to some of the other forest guys who have spent their lives working on or for smaller parcels, I tend to come at things from a slightly different angle, for better or worse. On the whole, I'm more focused on the economic side of things, and that's something that's reflected in my channel name. But this focus has given me a real appreciation for small parcels and small-scale operations, not just from a silvicultural standpoint, but from a pure business strategy standpoint. There's a very real advantage to being a small forest landowner, and you guys need to understand it, because if you don't understand it, you can't leverage it. You might try to do things like the big guys, or even worse, assume you can't do something and you're going to lose. However, if we really understand the advantages and utilize them, we can truly revolutionize small parcel timber production. But first, we have to delve into the weeds and talk about some economic theory. Here we have a graph of long-run average costs, or LRAC. Let's view this graph in the context of one of the simplest business models known to man, a lemonade stand. So it's your first day in business as a lemonade stand. What do you have to do? You have to buy a stand, you have to make a sign, you have to get some lemons and sugar, etc. Well, that first day in business, your costs are going to be fairly high. You don't have many customers, word hasn't quite gotten around town yet, and you had to make the capital investment of making the sign and buying a table or something for the stand. Now, maybe that's not that much, but lemonade isn't a very valuable product. So your cost per unit is very high because your production is still low. Over time, though, we acquire more customers and we produce more lemonade. And the costs of those initial investments are distributed over more units of production. So our cost per units go down. So those initial investments, the stand, are what are known as fixed costs. Those are the costs that aren't dependent on the level of production. But as we continue on, something else starts to happen. Suddenly we can buy lemons and sugar in bulk, and eventually maybe we can even buy our own little citrus grove or a few lemon trees and have our own citrus production. At that rate, our variable costs, that is to say the lemons and sugars and the things that are dependent on the level of production, those tend to drop as well. And now we have a very low level of per unit production costs. So what we're experiencing is what is known as an economy of scale. The more production you have, the lower your cost per unit is. And this is kind of the basis of a lot of American economic thought. Bigger is better. And certainly in a lot of industries and applications, this is a very real effect and it's fairly steep. So if we think of, for example, automotive production, there's a reason why small-scale automotive production isn't exactly competitive on a cost basis. Considering all the tooling and machinery you need to produce a vehicle, it's very difficult to produce cheap cars unless you have mass production. The same thing can be said about a lot of electronics. If you're starting from nothing, it can be difficult to acquire all the components necessary to make an electronic device. And so the winners in the electronics industry tend to be very large producers, such as Samsung. But this effect is not a universal truth. It does not always work out this way. Let's look back at the lemonade stand. Why are there no national lemonade stand brands? Where's that good old-fashioned American competitive spirit in the lemonade stand industry? We should be sending those 5-year-olds running home to their mommies. Well, there's something that happens sometimes as you get larger. Your long-run average cost starts to increase. This is called a diseconomy of scale, and it can take many forms. Maybe lemonade is a very limited market. Maybe it's a very seasonal market. Maybe after a while you have to go into a bigger facility and there simply isn't enough of a market in order to distribute the costs of the larger facility. Or maybe there isn't enough product differentiation or barriers to entry to prevent other firms from entering the market. After all, if you had a pretty good business just selling lemonade, there's nothing stopping other restaurants and other restaurant chains from doing the same. It's pretty easy for them. So this is the side of the graph that we always tend to forget about. So enough with this theoretical lemonade example. Let's look at forestry, and for a minute, let's just look at logging. So as we can probably all agree, it would be really stupid to buy a feller buncher to just cut 20 acres. At that rate, you would be buying a $400,000 machine to cut maybe $40,000 worth of wood. Your per unit costs would be extraordinarily high. But if you can get enough acreage to keep that feller buncher producing and cutting wood, suddenly your costs start to drop because the fixed cost of that machine starts to be distributed across more production. But the production of a single feller buncher is fairly limited. Eventually, the production is going to be maxed out. There's no way you can increase the production of a single machine. So at that rate, you have to buy 2 feller bunchers. So what happens? Well, our fixed costs have doubled, so there's not a huge benefit there. Now, one of the core benefits of increasing the scale of the lemonade stand was your variable costs started to drop. And remember, these are the costs that are dependent on the level of production. So with 2 feller bunchers, you're still buying diesel at the same price. For the most part, you're still buying parts for the same price. Maybe you can get some efficiencies here and there, but it's gonna be fairly limited. But some funky things start to happen once we have 2 feller bunchers. A feller buncher can't really exist by itself. All it does is cut trees and set them on the forest floor. It needs at least a skidder and a delimber in order to actually be useful. So once you have 2 feller bunchers, you also have multiple skidders and probably multiple delimbers. And you have to carefully balance the production between these machines. If the production of the feller bunchers outpaces the production of the skidders and delimbers, then the feller bunchers aren't going to be producing very efficiently. If the feller bunchers aren't matching the production of the skidders, then the skidders are going to be waiting a little longer. And likewise with the delimbers have to be matching the production of the other machines. And that's a very hard thing to balance. At any given time in any larger logging operation, it's very probable that there's a machine that is either faster or slower than the others. You can also have other issues, like at a certain point, especially if you're living in a small community, you can kind of tap out the skilled labor force of your area and you have to invest more in workforce development, which is a very common thing. There's a lot of problems with having a larger scale logging operation. But logging isn't land ownership. So now let's look at just forest production. So when you're buying that feller bunch, you're kind of locked into a certain productive level. There are no rungs of a ladder that you can climb up. A feller buncher is an expensive machine and it kind of has to produce at a certain level. Land ownership is not like that. Forests are infinitely divisible and will produce an exact proportion to their acreage. 1 acre of forest is going to produce 1 acre of wood. 2 acres will produce 2 acres, and so on. Now, if we look at the purchase price of land, obviously the larger the parcel size, the lower the price per acre. So if you're buying 1 acre, that's not really a viable size for serious forest production. So that's probably going to be like a building lot, and you might be paying $20,000 for 1 acre, or even more depending on the area. But if you want to buy 20 acres, then maybe it's only $2,000 or $3,000 per acre. You get up to 100 acres, maybe it's $1,500 per acre. You do 1,000,000 acres, you might only be paying $700 per acre. So just on the face of it, this may seem like an economy of scale, but this is different from other capital investments. This is more an equity investment. You're trading X amount of dollars for X amount of land, and you can also trade X amount of land for X amount of dollars. It's a fairly liquid investment, and it's going to appreciate over time, or at least track inflation. So the purchase cost of a property isn't a sunk cost. It's really just an opportunity cost. An opportunity cost is a funny thing. It's really kind of in the purview of philosophy, not business. It's still important, but it's a little different from more tangible costs. And when you actually analyze these things, it's a fairly small component of the overall cost of production. But I'll certainly be doing a longer video on that in the future because it warrants that. So now let's look at the variable costs of forest production. There's logging. We've already talked about that. Now let's look at foresters. Well, yeah, probably as a small landowner on a per acre basis, you're paying more for a forester. But think about it this way. A forester's job, ideally, is to increase the per acre production of a forest, or something approximating that. Now, obviously, there are other jobs and responsibilities. There's assuring contract compliance and other things, but nobody goes to forestry school because they're interested in contract compliance. So one company I worked for had something like 1 forester per every 50,000 acres. Do you think that 1 forester can effectively enhance production rates over 50,000 acres? Think back to my video about mortality rates and how much they affect the net growth of an acre. Imagine effectively monitoring the mortality of something like 50 million trees. Now imagine if you, as the landowner, took steps to understand forestry and silviculture because it's really not that complicated, and you yourself became the forester of your land. In that case, you'd have one forester monitoring 50 acres and 50,000 trees. So where on the curve of long-run average costs does that put us? Now what about trucking? Surely if you own 1 million acres and build your own private road systems, you can bring down the cost of trucking substantially. Where I come from, they even overload the trucks because they don't have to comply by DOT regulations. So you get more wood hauled per trip, more wood hauled per man hour, etc. Now some people make the argument that overloading trucks just increases capital expenses in the form of increasing the wear and tear on vehicles and the road system itself. But I do think there's probably a real economy of scale to be had in trucking and road systems. But, and this is an important but, a small landowner does not need trucking. I'll say that again. A small landowner does not need to have wood trucked. What if, for example, you had a small sawmill at the edge of your forest and you brought your logs to the sawmill, produced boards, and sold them to the local community? In that situation, your logging equipment is bringing the logs directly to the mill and your customers are coming and picking up the boards. You have completely cut out the middleman. There is no trucking in that equation. And that is a business model that is very unique to smaller landowners. Probably after owning only 300 acres does the possibilities for that type of situation drop off pretty dramatically. And this isn't a hypothetical business model. There's actually a guy very close to where I own my land that does this very thing. He has a wood miser sawmill, and he actually owns some pretty large forest equipment, and he just brings his logs directly to his mill. It's great. So on that note, let's talk about milling. Small sawmills are cheap, but they're also relatively unproductive. So when we look at mass-produced dimensional lumber like 2x4s, yeah, it can be very difficult for a small sawmill to compete on a cost basis. But a small sawmill is infinitely more flexible. It can produce virtually any product out there at a moment's notice. And that could be slabs, Adirondack siding, bridge timbers, framing timbers, really anything. And that's a huge advantage. Large mills cannot do that. It would cost them immense amount of money and time to completely retool their facilities and their processes just to produce a different product. But I've even seen medium-scale facilities reap the rewards of a more flexible production model. For example, I remember visiting a sawmill in rural Vermont, and they could alternate between runs of hardwood and white pine. And I even remember them telling me that occasionally they did runs of seasoned firewood in their kilns. They didn't really like doing that, but it was popular in the community, so they would do it to appease that demand once in a while. In a volatile price environment, crazy concept, I know, that can be incredibly valuable. And that's an important point about this cost curve. LRAC stands for long run average cost. Is producing a single forest product for the cheapest possible cost viable in the long run? I don't know. But I do think that when viewed in aggregate across various domains and time horizons, costs in forestry tend to be like pushing in on a balloon. You can push in one area, but you're just going to get expansion somewhere else. And I think I first realized this when having an argument with a coworker. At some point we were talking about the optimum size for a harvest block, and he was arguing that a harvest block should be larger, maybe 500 acres. And that way you could distribute the costs of starting the logging operation, such as transport costs of the machines and so on, over a larger acreage. That by itself is certainly an economy of scale. But then I was looking at that and saying, well, wait a minute, in order to get a block that's actually 500 acres, you'd have to be entering stands that you probably shouldn't be entering. So in order to get the economy of scale from the logging side of things, we were entering into a diseconomy of scale on the per acre forest production side of things. And to be honest, this isn't exactly a controversial or unique revelation. If you look at the largest forestry companies in the United States, the publicly traded guys and so forth, they tend to plant. That is their core forestry business model, is planting the most valuable species. And when you're looking at that, don't get me wrong, planting has its place, but the way they do it and the scale at which they do it, it's kind of an admission of the inherent diseconomies of scale in the forest. They're trying to make the forest more standardized. They try to apply a more tailorist mode of production to an inherently artisanal mode of production, and that mode of production is trees. Now, obviously, that can work, but it's flawed. But these industrial forests are a minority. The plurality of forests in the United States are owned by families, and they tend to be small parcels, around 60 acres in size. These acres could be so much more than they currently are, but we have to be able to leverage our inherent advantages. And if we can do that, we can really revolutionize America's forests and forest economy. And this is an effect that cannot be understated, and that's because of something known as an external economy of scale. Now, in microeconomics, external just means outside of a single firm. So an external economy of scale is when costs go down for all firms as a result of an increase in aggregate production. And I think a great example of this is actually in the economy of Mexico. So I'm currently filming in Oaxaca, Mexico, and there are entire communities made up of small producers of a given good, at least here in the south. So for example, there's a small village near to me called Teotitlan del Valle, and they produce rugs. They're the rug weaving community. So when you go there, you see a rug vendor around every corner, and your first thought is, there's so much competition, this can't be good business. How come some of these producers don't go down the road a little bit where they'd be the only rug producer? And that would actually be a very poor business decision. The entire state knows that Teotitlan produces rugs. Wholesalers go to Teotitlan to buy rugs. Tourists go to Teotitlan to buy rugs. Moreover, all the industry knowledge is there. If somebody's loom breaks, the parts and know-how in order to fix that loom is in Teotitlan del Valle. A community of small producers has become their own brand. By virtue of the fact that people are living in a community where everyone is weaving rugs, the cost per unit of production is fairly low for all the producers. So let's think back to forestry for a minute and go back to the guy I discussed who had the sawmill at his log landing, so he was able to cut out trucking. What if I started doing the same thing with my land? We're fairly close. Would we be competing with each other? Well, we're producing a commodity traded on global markets, so we can't actually affect the price of the commodity. Neither of us have enough productive capacity to satiate the demands of the local area. So no, not really. Maybe we're not benefiting each other too much, but we're not competing with each other. But something happens once you get maybe 2 more entrants into the market. Suddenly you start advertising for each other. Suddenly people become aware that this group of guys who do small-scale custom milling exist. And maybe they start to get creative with the possibilities there. Maybe they start to realize they don't have to go 2 hours to Lowe's to get some wood. They can just go to the guy next door. It's a very real possibility that by having multiple people doing the exact same thing, the total market for everyone is increased. And again, that's just one aspect. You can apply this principle to basically anything. If you have enough small landowners actively managing their land in one area, all of a sudden it becomes viable for people to start investing in small log trucks, small logging equipment, and the industry actually morphs itself around the small landowner. And these external economies of scale already exist. For example, where I am in northern Maine, the industry is molded around large industrial landowners. It's a bit tougher for guys like me that only have small parcels. But New Hampshire, totally different story. There's so much more of the forest industry in New Hampshire that's molded around small landowners. But it still could be better, a lot better. And that's actually one of my long-term goals, to help make it better. And that concept is a core principle behind everything that I'm doing. Every time I upload a video, it's kind of like me uploading the tree part of my brain. Not because I think I know everything about forestry, but I know that I can help other people achieve these external economies of scale. And I hope others can do the same. And I still have a long way to go and many more projects to come, but I'm not going to stop. So if you want to start, a great way is to look in the description and in the pinned comment below and go to my website and download my free ebook, How to Read Your Forest. It's an introduction to forest management, covers a lot about the basics of silviculture and forestry, the types of silvicultural treatments, forestry equipment, and of course, various methods of measuring timber. So that's all for now, guys. Hopefully you found that interesting and I didn't bore you too much with the economic theory side of things. But if you enjoyed this, please like, leave a comment, and of course, subscribe because there's going to be a lot more coming your way. All right, until next time.